Thank you. So the next item of business this afternoon is a debate on motion 20519 in the name of Daniel Johnson on the Restraint and Seclusion in Schools Scotland Bill at Stage 1. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Daniel Johnson, the member in charge, to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And it's a huge privilege to move the motion in my name, seeking Parliament's support for the purposes and general principles of my bill. I'd first like to begin by thanking the committee for their diligent and detailed report. The insights that they have provided Parliament with will strengthen this legislation. Likewise, I'd like to thank the Government for their ongoing dialogue, and particularly with Jenny Goldruth. This dialogue has been constructive and extremely useful. The non-government bill unit is a jewel of this Parliament and must be acknowledged, as must my office team, and particularly Philip Miller. But the greatest acknowledgement really must go to Beth Morrison. Her tireless campaigning on this issue began when her son Callum returned home in 2010 covered in bruises. He'd been pinned down by 4 adults face down in a prone restraint simply because he didn't want to get off a bike. In 2015, she lodged a petition urging Parliament to create Callum's Law to deal with this issue. So in 2022, when Beth asked me if I would take this proposal forward, I was pleased to, because I knew Beth and Callum's experiences were not isolated. In 2018, the Children and Young Persons People's Commissioner published a report in No Safe Place. The report identified 2,674 instances of restraint and seclusion relating to 386 children. But it also found that only 18 of 32 local authorities were recording this information, and even fewer doing so comprehensively at a child level. These findings have been reinforced by several subsequent reports from many trusted organisations such as Enable, PABS, Children in Scotland, National Autistic Society Scotland, Scottish Autism, and were also raised in the Morgan Review on Additional Support Needs commissioned by the Government. Through the last Parliament, I listened to many parents, anguish and pain, retelling stories where they had struggled to find out why their children had returned home with bruises. Children overwhelmingly of primary school age, children with autism, ADHD and learning difficulties, and often with diminished communication. So I felt compelled to act, compelled to do what I could to make Callum's Law a reality, and that is why I bring this bill before Parliament today. So let me set out its 4 key provisions. First, to create a duty on Scottish ministers to issue statutory guidance on the use of restraint and seclusion in schools, refreshing the existing non-statutory guidance. And this is not to create something new, but simply to put guidance on a statutory footing, ensuring that long-standing inconsistencies are eradicated, and by ensuring that we have clear and consistent practice across Scotland. Second, to create a duty on schools to inform parents and carers to be informed promptly if their child has been restrained or secluded. We simply have to end the anguish and frustration experienced by so many parents faced by this situation. Schools act in loco parentis, and in physical interventions or seclusion space, it is vital that parents and carers are informed promptly. Third is to require the recording and reporting on the use of restraint and seclusion in schools, because despite this being part of Scottish Government guidance for almost a decade, we still do not have consistency of recording, and we do not have a clear national picture of the frequency or variation in these practices. The fourth, to create a duty on the Scottish Government to maintain a list of approved training providers to ensure safe practice. This bill does not seek to stop physical interventions, but when they do occur, it must ensure that best possible practice is used and support is provided to those practitioners who need to use it. Overall, we should seek to minimise the use of restraint and seclusion in schools and ensure that it is only used as a last resort and where there is an immediate risk of harm. I also acknowledge that there are concerns about the proposals set out in the bill. But let me be clear, this bill simply puts on a statutory footing what should already be happening. Its obligations rest with local authorities and schools, not individual teachers. And critically, it is vital that those practitioners that may need training get the best possible training, and it certainly does not require all teachers to be trained. So that is what my bill will do. It should improve matters for practitioners, parents, and above all, children. I'm happy to give way to
Dr. Ross.
for the member in charge giving way. I wonder, as he's articulating these points, if he'd like to address the many emails that MSPs have received from EIS, the campaign email urging people to oppose the bill, because he articulated very well his views in an email to MSPs, but I think it would be useful to get that on the record.
Daniel Johnson.
I'm grateful for the intervention. I have just 6 minutes, and I'd also like to address the committee points. But essentially, this is not new. This is something that should be reinforcing existing practice. The obligation will be for local authorities and for schools. But above all else, I would say this, is that use of physical intervention is a very serious matter, and it is vital that we have the most robust framework around that. But turning to the committee's recommendations, again, I don't have time right now to go through all of them, but I think the most important ones around definitions. And it's important to be clear that the definitions primarily set the scope for guidance, but I do note the committee's concerns that highlight potential ambiguity, particularly around what should be reported and recorded. So I commit to Parliament to bring forward amendments at stage 2 to address those specific concerns around the definitions for recording and reporting. And finally, let me just close with this observation. All parents will be familiar with the slips of paper that come home when a child grazes their knee after falling in the playground. And so I ask Parliament this. If that is the level of recording, monitoring and reporting that is required when a child is injured accidentally, surely, if an injury occurs because of a deliberate physical intervention, we need just as robust a framework to sit around that. And with that, I ask Parliament's agreement to proceed at stage 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. I now call on Douglas Ross on behalf of the Education, Children and Young People Committee. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I am delighted to be speaking on behalf of the Education, Children and Young People Committee. And can I begin by thanking Daniel Johnson as the member in charge for bringing forward and introducing this important bill, and apologise, I didn't realise he only had 6 minutes when I intervened at 5 minutes into his speech. But his proposal did give us, as the lead committee for this bill, the opportunity to discuss the important issue of how to ensure that restraint and seclusion is only used as a last resort in schools. I'd also like to thank my committee colleagues for their work in this bill, and to everyone who provided evidence, either in person or by responding to our call for views. I'd also like to thank the DPLR Committee and the Finance and Public Administration Committees for their scrutiny of the bill. Could I also put on record the committee's thanks to everyone at the Donaldson Trust who generously gave their time and shared their thoughts and insights into this bill when the committee visited the campus in Linlithgow last year. But the biggest praise has to go to 2 individuals without whom we would not be here today. Beth Morrison and Kate Sanger have been campaigning for over a decade for change in law on restraint and seclusion. I know Kate can't be with us today because she's attending a family funeral, but I did see Beth and Callum coming in to the public gallery. They are, without doubt, Kate and Beth, the most determined, passionate and articulate campaigners for change, and this Parliament has an opportunity to reward their hard work by voting for this bill tonight. And I simply do not believe we would be here today if it were not for their efforts. And we have to think about how they got involved, because of terrible circumstances within their family. In dealing with the issues that Laura had to face, Kate, as a mother, could have just tried other routes to get answers and not embarked on a campaign that has taken years to get here. When Callum came home from school that day and unable to articulate what had happened to him, Beth could have sat there and thought about what she could do. She could have complained, she could have done this, she could have done that. But she tried to get change. When that didn't happen, she put in a petition. When the petition didn't work, she brought forward the bill with Daniel Johnson. It is that type of tireless effort that makes me very proud to be standing in Parliament today supporting this bill. And it is a bill that the committee unanimously agreed to the general principles of and welcomed the aim of putting the current guidance on a statutory footing. I'm pleased to say that the Scottish Government accepted all of the report recommendations, some of them accepted in part, but they did accept them all. And we were concerned to hear of instances of inappropriate use of restraint and seclusion in Scotland schools, particularly in relation to children and young people with additional support needs or a disability. As with all the committee's scrutiny, the devil is always in the detail, and we did have a number of areas that needed to be addressed should this bill progress further today. Firstly, the definitions of restraint and seclusion do need to be looked at. Although broadly similar to the definitions in the current non-statutory guidance, we shared the concerns of witnesses that these broad definitions could lead to legal ambiguity or unintended consequences. Teaching staff and parents and carers all need clarity on this, and it's important that physical interventions that are not of obvious concern are not captured by the bill. As our report makes clear, communication with parents and carers is key, and the bill would create a duty on schools to inform parents and carers when their child has been subject to restraint or seclusion. We were, like the member in charge, disturbed to hear that that was not happening already, and parents and carers in some cases were not told when their child or young person had been restrained or secluded. Given this, we said that this notification must take place on the same day, and there should be a report made on any intervention no later than 24 hours after the incident occurred. And on the recording and reporting provisions of the bill, these are welcomed and will provide an opportunity for school staff to conduct post-incident reviews and to establish any lessons learned following any incident. Finally, on the matter of training, whilst the bill does not include provisions around mandatory training on the use of restraint and seclusion, it says that the guidance must include details of training for school staff, and it also provides that the Scottish Government would maintain a list of approved training providers. Presiding Officer, the Education, Children and Young People Committee supports the general principles of the bill. However, there are issues that need to be addressed, as I've set out today, and we have had an assurance from the member in charge that he is keen to do that. And I say that on behalf of the committee, but on a personal note, I just want to end by saying, when I vote yes to this bill tonight, I will be doing so to progress an important piece of legislation. But more importantly, it will be my individual way of thanking and recognising Beth and Kate and the many other families they have represented on this long journey, because their efforts will hopefully at decision time see this bill take a step forward and get improvements for our children and young people that we have been waiting for so long. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Ross. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Jennifer Ruth to open on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I want to start today by congratulating Daniel Johnson on the progress he has made thus far in legislating on restraint and seclusion. Mr Johnson and I have been engaged over the course of this Parliament for months, and actually years probably, since we first met throughout this session, and I am grateful to him for the extremely collegiate way in which we've been able to discuss and debate the issues pertinent to today's Stage 1 debate. For clarity, and again for the record, the Scottish Government will be supporting the general principles of the bill today. There are, of course, a number of others to thank, Presiding Officer, as we've heard already today. By no means least the families of those children who experience restraint in distressing environments. As we've heard from Douglas Ross and Daniel Johnson already, Beth Morrison and Kate Sanger are to be applauded for their tenacious efforts in driving the changes which come before Parliament today. And I'm very pleased that Beth and her son Callum are with us in Parliament today, and I look forward to meeting with them again following today's debate. Presiding Officer, I'm very grateful to the Parliament's Education Committee for their instructive role, and also to stakeholders, to families, to campaigners and practitioners for their support thus far. MSPs from across the Chamber will, I am sure, agree that our collective understanding of this issue and its impact has been strengthened by the willingness of parents, of young people as well, to share their personal experiences. The Government is clear that restraint and seclusion should only ever be used as a last resort to prevent injury. And as members will be aware, we published our non-statutory guidance for schools on physical intervention in November 2024, which reinforces this position. We are currently reviewing the effectiveness of this guidance. And while the Scottish Government's intention was to conclude a review of the guidance before considering legislative options, I have nonetheless engaged constructively with Mr Johnson's bill since the bill was introduced in March of last year. In June of last year, I wrote to the committee to confirm the Scottish Government's support for the general principles, whilst reserving the right to seek to amend any provisions where necessary, and that remains, of course, the Government's position today. I very much share the committee's clear commitment to ensuring that all children in Scotland's schools are supported in ways which uphold their dignity, their rights and their safety. And I welcome the committee's Stage 1 report and its conclusions. I was pleased to meet with Mr Johnson earlier this week. As ever, it was a productive discussion on areas in which we will like to work together and strengthen the bill at Stage 2. This is, of course, a Member's bill, and Mr Johnson will retain responsibility for its passage through Parliament. But I agree with committee members that the statutory definitions of restraint and seclusion need to be workable, they need to be clear and aligned with children's rights. It is important, as the committee stresses, that a distinction is made between restraint and physical interventions that do not raise wellbeing concerns. Such distinctions will help reduce the risks of over-reporting and overburdening on our school staff. I have agreed to work with Daniel Johnson to develop Stage 2 amendments to address those concerns that have been raised in that regard. The committee also raises important points regarding national reporting routes and the avoidance of duplication. And I very much accept the recommendation that further joint work is needed, particularly on approaches for independent and grant-aided schools and for situations involving care settings. Accordingly, Mr Johnson and I have agreed that an amendment should be lodged at Stage 2 to allow independent and grant-aided schools to report directly to ministers rather than via local authorities, which will help to ensure clarity and proportionality. I have discussed the financial implications of the bill with Mr Johnson, and I know he shares my desire for the associated costs to be kept to a minimum. Should Parliament agree to the general principles of the bill today, I can commit that the Government will lodge a financial resolution in the coming weeks. The bill also places a duty on the Government to produce statutory guidance, and as I alluded to, the Government produced our existing 2024 guidance, but that guidance will form the backbone of the statutory guidance required under the bill. And I therefore welcome the alignment which Mr Johnson has sought with our existing guidance in many areas. Yes, I voted.
Daniel Johnson.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving me, and indeed her kind words. I wonder if she'd agree with me that it's also important to stress that while that guidance was published in 2024, the 2017 guidance also makes clear about the requirement to both record and monitor, but also that training should be provided. So those points are not new ones, either introduced by my bill or indeed by the 2024 guidance.
Cabinet Secretary.
Happy to support the points that Mr Johnson has made. The guidance will be familiar to teaching staff and those who work in our schools, and I think it's important to remind colleagues and of course stakeholders as well that this will not be, for many staff who work in our schools just now, new in relation to the approaches that are being taken. It is the differentiation in relation to it now becoming statutory through legislation. I very much welcome the committee's acknowledgement of the importance of trauma-informed training in relation to that being grounded in clear national standards. We know that training is key to successful implementation, of course, of the bill and the guidance, but as the committee have acknowledged, restraint is not a practice which the vast majority of our school staff will need to use. Therefore, restraint training will only be necessary for a small number of our school staff, and I think that is, too, an important point which we discussed during Stage 1 at committee. Finally, on the national data collection, the committee is absolutely right that the reporting system must support transparency, accountability and learning. However, as the committee have acknowledged, the creation of league tables of restraint data needs to be avoided at all costs. I therefore welcome the committee's agreement with the government's position that the publication of school-level data would not be appropriate. Presiding Officer, I commit to continuing to work constructively with the member in charge and, of course, with the committee to strengthen the bill at stages 2 and 3 and to ensure that its implementation leads to meaningful, positive change for some of Scotland's most vulnerable children, young people and for their families.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Miles Briggs to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I also start by paying tribute to Daniel Johnson for the work that he and I know his office will have undertook to bring forward this private member's bill. And I know, having taken forward 2 consultations, just how much pressure that does bring to your office. So I really do want to use this opportunity, as other members have, to pay tribute to the member for getting this bill to where it is today. It is a few years ago now that I did have the pleasure meeting Beth, Peter and Callum in Parliament at a round-table event which Daniel Johnson had brought forward so that parliamentarians across the chamber had an opportunity to hear what the issue was. And at that time, I remember keeping a document which Beth gave us, and it was outlining the experience that Callum had had, and specifically to go back to maybe why we are here today, and that is Friday the 24th of September 2010, when the school bus dropped Callum home at 3:25. His face was ashen, his lips blue. He was wearing different clothes from those he'd left in the morning. A thin T-shirt, shorts and plimsolls, no underwear and no coat. His own clothes were soaked in urine and stuffed in a plastic bag. Now, that should not be happening in this day and age in Scotland. And I really do hope that today's opportunity which presents us with this bill will make sure that no parent or carer in our country will ever face a similar situation. I hope the bill can make sure that that does happen. Now, in a time that I have today, I also wanted to highlight a number of constituents who have told me of their children's experiences, and in every case, the fact that they've not been able to get answers from those who they trust with their children's education, but also safety and well-being. And a number of parents have highlighted to me what is indeed currently a postcode lottery on how schools work in terms of not only restraint, but also in recording of incidents, and actually how they are communicating with parents what's gone on in the school day. Now, I, as the convener of the Education Committee, has already put on record, think we need to understand and learn from the concerns which are being put forward by EIS Scotland, and I certainly know the committee did not shy away from trying to probe those, because the concerns which have been highlighted are citing workforce pressures and also the legal standing of this bill. And I think there's a really important opportunity. There will be cross-party support for this bill this evening, I know that, but we have a real important role as Parliament at stage 2 in committee, but also at stage 3 before the election, to make sure that these questions are also answered. And I believe the Education Young People Committee's consideration and unanimous support for the bill has provided that critique as well. I believe it's unacceptable for children to return home having been restrained, and for their parents and carers to have no information provided on what an incident has taken place. I believe it's unacceptable that we are seeing the recording of these incidents. Often when we're talking about non-verbal children, what restraint has taken place? Callum was restrained at age 11 by 4 adults, but the training which isn't being recorded, the training providers, we don't know what level they're training people up to. I always think de-escalation should be the first point of call. But I would acknowledge SNP ministers have looked towards improving guidance. That was never going to alone be good enough to protect children. So I really welcome the Scottish Government moving to support the bill and make sure it's taken through Parliament. To close, Presiding Officer, a legal framework should establish lines of not only responsibility, training standards and reporting requirement, but the safety each and every one of us would expect children in our schools to enjoy. And for that reason, Scottish Conservatives will support the general principles of the bill at decision time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Briggs. I now call on Paul O'Kane to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'll begin by joining colleagues from across the Chamber in thanking my friend and colleague Daniel Johnson for his work on this issue and on this bill. It's no small feat to bring together a member's bill. Given his work and success in passing the Protection of Workers Bill in the last session of Parliament, he knows that more than most. And of course to pay tribute to his staff who have carried out this work with great aplomb and with good humour in the Labour corridor, I must say, even when I know they've been very busy in preparing to get to this day. And as Scottish Labour's education spokesperson, I'm very pleased to confirm the Scottish Labour will support the general principles of the bill at decision time today, much, I'm sure, to the relief of my colleague Daniel Johnson, who sits beside me on the front bench. We've heard already about the tireless work of campaigners that has brought us to today. And looking at the public gallery for me is looking at a group of old friends, because colleagues in the Chamber know, and I declare an interest, that I worked for 7 years prior to coming to this Parliament for Enable Scotland. I'm still a member of Enable Scotland, and that's where I first got to know Beth and Peter and Callum, and to work with some extraordinary people there on these issues. And as we've heard already, Beth is a ferocious campaigner. She is tenacious, but she has compassion and she has so much joy in her life brought to her by her family, and that's her motivation, I know, in all of this. And not only does Beth campaign, and not only has Beth worked on these issues to bring us here today, but she also educates. And I think that's really important. Everything I probably know about these issues and everything I know about all the alternative interventions that can be provided, I probably know through the work of Beth. And I would associate Kate Sanger with that as well. Kate has worked really closely with Beth and with others in this space, and it is the reason that we are here today and with Daniel Johnson taking this bill forward. So I suppose in some ways becoming shadow education spokesperson just in time to lead on this bill for Labour was probably meant to be in some ways, given my association with the early parts of this campaign. Of course, today we build on work by organisations like Enable Scotland, National Autistic Society as well, people who have supported the campaigners to drive forward these issues and to ensure that they don't disappear off the agenda, or with the comings of elections and changes of Parliament, that they were forgotten about somehow. And it's built on substantial work that was undertaken, such as the Children's Commissioner with No Safe Place, Enable Scotland's In Safe Hands work, a myriad of data, of reporting, of sharing people's experiences of some of the dreadful things that have happened to our children in school settings and other settings across Scotland. And I think in concert with colleagues today, I would recognise that we have an opportunity today to make a legislative change that actually will be a turning point and will be a moment in which we say that that sort of seclusion and restraint is no longer acceptable, and that the recording and the duty of candour which will exist will be put on that legislative footing, and that is important. Of course, like colleagues, I recognise some of the concerns that have been raised, not least by the EIS and others. I think Daniel Johnson will very clearly outline his response to that, and he is willing very much to engage and has engaged throughout this process, and stage 2 and 3 will allow us to do more of that. But what I think I recognise in the outset of today's debate is that there is a genuine will across this Parliament to ensure that we get this right, to ensure that we put this on a statutory footing, to ensure that no young person will have to experience the situation that Callum and the other young people have experienced, and that today we make a statement from this Parliament that says that children will be protected and will be equally safe under the law. So I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Sir Keane. And I call Maggie Chapman, around 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking and congratulating Daniel Johnson on his bill and all the work he's put into it. I thank the committee for their meticulous scrutiny during stage 1, and I want to recognise especially Beth Morrison. We would not be here without her tireless campaigning to prevent anyone else going through what she and her son Callum went through. This bill responds to the very real experiences of children and families who have told us time and again that restraint and seclusion can be frightening, humiliating and deeply traumatic. And, most importantly, often avoidable. Not, as it should be, a rare occurrence and last resort, but used in some cases on a daily basis. At the same time, this Parliament is on a journey towards enshrining and protecting the rights of children and young people. With the UN Convention now part of our laws, and my Green colleague John Finney's bill ending legal physical punishment of children, it's a natural next step to ensure that restraint of children and young people becomes a thing of the past, except in the rarest of circumstances. The strong backing by the Children and Young People's Commissioner and the promise should give Parliament confidence that this bill is both necessary and proportionate. It sets a clear expectation that restraint and seclusion are measures of last resort, used only to prevent harm, never as punishment, for the shortest possible time and within a transparent, rights-based framework that protects both children and staff. And no more must parents and guardians find out about restraint from seeing the bruises on their child, as the committee heard. The bill provides a guarantee that parents must be informed within 24 hours. This is crucial. Many children and young people who are restrained have additional support needs. When these actions prove necessary, it's not because the child or young person is at fault, but because their needs have not been met. This is often because we have nowhere near enough support in our schools for children with additional support needs. I was struck particularly by Kate Sanger's evidence. In many cases, a child's scream is not aggression, but communication. Understanding why a child vocalises the way they do seems so obvious. Her communication passport should be commonplace. I also want to address directly the concerns raised by the EIS in good faith, given their commitment to the well-being of their members and the young people they teach and support. However, I do not accept that a statutory framework inevitably creates a blame culture. On the contrary, inconsistency and unclear expectations are what leave staff exposed. It reinforces that restraint is about safety and that staff acting within guidance should be supported. Concerns have also been raised that definitions could be too broad and inadvertently capture ordinary, caring physical interactions, as we've already heard this afternoon. So I support refining definitions at stage 2 so that restraint is clearly understood as a serious physical intervention. On training, the bill does not require all teachers to undergo training in physical intervention techniques. What it requires is statutory guidance on training and an up-to-date list of approved providers, something that already exists on a non-statutory basis. Decisions about who needs specialist training will continue to be made sensibly by frontline professionals, but with the support of guidance and with a strong emphasis on de-escalation and prevention. I understand the EIS's concerns about workload, but given the seriousness of restraint and seclusion, recording cannot be optional. Evidence to the committee showed that recording and parental communication are currently inconsistent across local authorities, and a proper system of recording is necessary to address that. Finally, on resources, I agree wholeheartedly with the EIS that reducing restraint depends on investment in staff, in specialist support, in time for relationships and early intervention. This bill should not be a substitute for that investment, but it is a necessary foundation for it. Presiding Officer, this bill is about rights, transparency and support. It is about keeping children safe and ensuring that the workforce caring for them is properly guided and protected. The Scottish Greens will support this at stage 1, and we look forward to improving it as it progresses. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I call Willie Rennie, around 4 minutes.
I want to congratulate Daniel Johnson for getting this far with this bill. He's done a very professional job in convincing all sides of the merits of the bill. And I think there are lots of merits to this bill. But if anybody had any doubt about this bill, I would advise them to go and meet Beth Morrison, because anybody who wants to go up against Beth Morrison should think again. She is a very effective and forceful campaigner, and that is why, in part, Daniel Johnson has been so successful today. Now, I was an original supporter of the bill. I signed up to the bill, but that didn't stop me asking the difficult questions in the committee, because that's our role in the committee, is to ask those difficult questions. And I do welcome the government's support, and they were cautious in the early days, so it's even more significant that they are prepared to support this bill. The bill is simple in one respect. It moves, as Daniel Johnson says, the guidance that already exists from its current status to a statutory footing. So it's very simple in one respect. It also includes training and recording. But we should always be careful when we put anything on a statutory footing, because although it does bring an extra seriousness in which the guidance is considered, it gives it greater priority, it also potentially introduces greater caution. And sometimes that caution at a moment when actual clear, decisive decision-making is required can be unhelpful, which is something I'm going to return to. So I'm grateful to the EIS, as others have said, for raising the issues that they're concerned about, because that's part of the accountability process on culture, resources, on timing, on workload, but also on training. Now, of those issues that were raised through the evidence sessions, I think there were two that were particularly important. At a critical moment, when a decision was required about the safety of a child, you do not want caution. You want clarity about what is required to happen. And if, because it's on the statute, that member of staff is too cautious, that child could be harmed as a result. And that's something we've got to be very mindful of when we're considering this. And secondly, it's easy to work out what great practice is. And it's easy to work out what dreadful practice is. It's always the bits in the middle that's really hard to determine. And we need absolute clarity, because that feeds into the first point, about what is the right thing to do. And that's why putting it on a statutory footing, in my view, is essential now, because we have had guidance for years, and actually it's not been given the emphasis, the priority, the seriousness in which it deserves. So putting on the statutory footing, I think, will help bring that clarity and decisiveness at critical moments. But of course, we've got to be clear to the teaching profession and to staff, because this is not just about restraint. There is a wider debate about behaviour, about violence in schools, particularly around about additional support needs, over 40% now. So there's a whole debate about inclusion and about how we manage young people, how we give them specialist additional support in the school. Yes, certainly.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, to Mr Rennie for giving way on that point. I'm thoughtful about the points he's making in relation to ASN and behaviour in particular. Is it Mr Rennie's view then that the Government in future should consider putting other pieces of guidance on a statutory footing? I am interested in this point because there are a number of areas that we've legislated for during this parliamentary session, not least Liz Smith's outdoor education bill. We now have before us Daniel Johnson's members' bill in relation to restraint. And that, to me, would shift quite a lot the way in which educational governance is provided for in the country. But I'm interested in this point in relation to how that guidance could be strengthened, because we do see issues in our schools at the current time in relation to how national guidance percolates into our schools when it's not on a statutory footing.
Willie Rennie, can give you the time back.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is the point the Children's Commissioner raised during the evidence. She said she was in favour of putting this on a statutory footing, but she said so much of the landscape isn't on a statutory footing and needs to be considered. And the more you legislate, the more complicated the interactions become. So therefore, we have got to look at how we have a wholesome approach, a full considered approach across the landscape. Because that is also part of that wider debate, that discussion we're having about behaviour, about violence, about additional support needs, about all of that. And I think, therefore, we have got to be crystal clear what we're saying to staff and teachers about what we are expecting of them, because sometimes contradictory messages come out from this place and from the government. So we've got to be clear about that. So I'll be sympathetic to having a look at the legislative landscape on all of that. But just in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think the real benefits of this bill is that it will bring clarity, it will bring priority, and it will bring confidence to the staff about what we expect them to do and how they should conduct themselves as professionals. And for all those reasons, we will be supporting the bill this evening.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate. I call Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Claire Baker. Around 4 minutes. Ms Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I also congratulate Daniel Johnson and thank him for bringing this bill forward. And also thank you to my Education and Young People Committee colleagues, of course our clerks and those who have given evidence to our committee. And as everyone has in the chamber who's already spoken said, particular thanks must go to Beth Morrison and Kate Sanger, who have worked tirelessly on the issue of restraint and seclusion in Scotland's schools. Let me start my comments by saying that this is a good bill. There's wide recognition that something more needs to be done about the restraint and seclusion in schools. And what is in this bill is largely something that will help. However, I do fear timing may stop this bill being the best it could be. That's not saying that I'm against the bill. A few months before this bill was first introduced, the Scottish Government published guidance on the use of physical intervention in schools, and there is a fairly substantial overlap between that guidance and this bill being brought forward. Guidance was introduced in November 2024, and the one-year review of the guidance is currently underway, with a final report expected this March. Obviously, this bill aims to go further than just guidance, but in an ideal world, given the overlap in the subject matter, we would be able to get that report before we proceed or finish with this bill. And the bill, I think, would be stronger for it. And the results for young folk would be better because of it. But timelines aren't really going to allow for that before Parliament is devolved for the election. If we wait, this bill gets pushed into the next Parliament. It would then have to restart its progress, and it will push pause on a lot of good that this bill wants to achieve. So I think the phrase "perfect is the enemy of good" probably sums up where I am on this as far as timing goes. I think this bill could be made better if we had that review completed now, but we don't. And I can't justify pausing the bill until we do. So I'm pleased that the committee recommended, if this bill is paused, that it should not commence, and should be passed, that it should not commence until after the review. Presiding Officer, there is thankfully other reports that is available to inform changes to this bill. One of those is the Education and Young People's Committee's report. So let me just use my remaining time to pick up some of the changes we are keen to see. One change we would like to see is having the definitions of restraint and seclusion tightened up and refined. There's a fear that the current broad definitions of restraint and seclusion in the bill could cause legal ambiguity and unintended consequences. Some of our witnesses were keen to see examples included, and equally that goes both ways because it can make clear what isn't included in the definition. As an example, giving someone a bosey isn't restraint, but we maybe need to make that bit a bit clearer. The other key change I am fully supportive of is to ensure that parents and carers are informed the same day that restraint and/or seclusion has taken place, or 24 hours. I think Ben Higgins from the Restraint Reduction Network summed that up pretty well, and I quote, "I think it is good practice that when a child falls over and gets a scratch, a mark, a bump or a bruise, the parents and carers are informed. Why would that not apply in the case of restraint seclusion?" Presiding Officer, there's broad agreement about the principles of this bill. There's broad agreement about the changes that we want to see. So let's get this moving forward and continue our efforts to make Scotland the best country in the world to grow up for every child. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Dunbar. And I call Claire Baker to be followed by Karen Adam. Around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The background to this bill has been well set out this afternoon by Daniel Johnson, and I congratulate him on reaching stage 1. The issue of restraint and seclusion has been a topic of discussion for some time, and like other members, I have met with parents and campaigners and heard why they feel legislation is necessary. I have listened to their concerns around incidents of inappropriate restraint and recognise that many of them have shared personal and upsetting stories of their own children's distress in order to inform this bill's progress. And along with Daniel Johnson, I want to recognise the role of Beth Morrison and Callum and their representation of other families and their children in the pursuit of this legislation. I recognise there are some who have concerns around the bill, including some in the teaching profession, which I'll come on to, but I do note that the Education, Children and Young People Committee, having scrutinised the bill, were in unanimous support of the general principles. I also welcome the briefing provided by the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland, which sets out their support in line with recommendations from the UN. In terms of definitions, I know the member in charge of the bill has indicated he is happy to work with the Scottish Government and others to reach agreement on a definition that is suitable without encompassing everyday interactions. I also welcome that there is work being undertaken around developing a human rights compatible definition of restraint that would apply across education, care and health service settings so that we can ensure a consistent legal framework. Some teachers in my region have raised practical concerns, particularly around unintended consequences and staff confidence. They are right to highlight pressures already facing the profession. The EIS is clear that restraint and seclusion should be measures of last resort, and they are concerned that proposals introducing statutory guidance on this could negatively impact on the need to openly discuss intervention, potentially leading to a culture of fear and anxiety for teachers and staff worried about potential consequences. But I would be clear that placing existing guidance on a statutory footing is about consistency, clarity and accountability, so that there is consistency across local authorities, that it is clear to pupils, teachers and parents. And it is in line with the promotion of positive relationships and behaviour and of early intervention. It aims to underline the preventative approach while providing clarity around processes that should be followed, and all these principles are already within the current guidance. Impacts of additional training and the recording of incidences have also been highlighted, including the implications in workload and training for staff who are already under significant pressure. It is always worth underlining the vital role that teachers and their educational staff do and the consequences for those individuals in the teaching profession of increasing demands in terms of workload which they continue to face. The lack of sufficient time, staffing and resources in teaching is a recurring issue and is one which is much broader in scope than that of the bill. We know that investment in education is needed, and while I accept this legislation could introduce some additional workload in terms of recording and reporting requirements, there is an acknowledgement this is necessary and it is achievable. Wider failures in resourcing education cannot be used as a reason to avoid necessary reform in pupil safeguarding. The recording of incidents and of quality training for teachers in physical intervention are important measures. We know that part of the reasoning behind the bill was the inconsistency across local authorities with recording and communication. The guidance in this area would need to ensure a balance between consistency and practicality. And my colleague Daniel Johnson has been clear that it would not be the case that everyone in the profession will require training in physical intervention. The bill would require the publication by the Scottish Government of statutory guidance on the training of staff, something that's already been done on a non-statutory basis, and for them to maintain an up-to-date list of approved training providers. So this bill is about clarity, consistency and child protection. With work at the next stages to define definitions and manage practical impacts, it can deliver strong safeguards for children while supporting staff. And for these reasons, I support the bill's principles and its progression. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Baker. I now call Karen Adam to be followed by George Adam. Around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, I want to start my remarks where the public conversation on this bill started, and that is with the parents and the carers who have had to live through something that we should never normalise in any school setting, not for any child, not in any part of Scotland. And I do pay tribute to them, the campaigners, Beth and Kate, for their strength and their determination, and to Daniel Johnson for believing in them, for believing in their plight, and for the Education Committee for a measured and thorough report. Restraint and seclusion should ever only be used as a last resort to prevent injury. That is the government's position, and it's one that I support. It should be rooted in children's rights, in safety and in basic human dignity. For too many families, the harm has not just been the incident itself, though. It's what comes afterwards. The uncertainty, the delay for answers, the lack of clarity, and sometimes just feeling that they're being kept at arm's length from information about their own child. And that is why parents and carers have pushed for consistency, for transparency, and for a change that is real, not just well-meaning. Presiding Officer, I come to this not just as an MSP, but also as a parent of children with additional support needs, and I have witnessed restraint and seclusion used with my own children in primary school. And even now, that memory does cause frustration. So I want to say from the outset that I send my wholehearted support to the parents and to the children and young people, and I share in their frustration, and I do understand. The petition that was lodged back in 2015 and then another in 2018 to the Children and Young People's Commissioner in Scotland highlighted inconsistent practice across local authorities and a lack of monitoring. Now, these are not small issues. If practice is inconsistent, then rights are inconsistent. If monitoring is weak, then learning is weak and trust is weak, and trust is what families need most. So I therefore do welcome the Scottish Government's guidance published in November 2024, built around relationships and rights, prevention, de-escalation and post-incident support, because that guidance does matter, and it was developed with stakeholder engagement, which is really important, which included parents, education staff, local government and unions. And I'm glad to see that the one-year review is now underway, with a final report expected in March 2026. Presiding Officer, I don't see this as an either-or. It's trying to put key expectations on a statutory footing, and I note that the Government will support the general principles at stage 1 while being honest about the amendments that may be required. And I think it is responsible because it respects the complexity of this, and it's important that we do give it the chance to get the detail right at stage 2. What I hear from parents and carers is not a desire to punish staff. It's a desire to be treated as a partner, to be informed promptly, and to have an accurate record, and to know that there is clear national expectation and that children's rights are not optional depending on a postcode. I also know and understand that schools are operating in really tough conditions. Distressed behaviour has increased and workloads are heavy, and staff safety matters too. And that's exactly why we must get this right for everyone that is involved. And I believe that we can do both. We can protect children's rights and we can support staff with clear, workable expectations, training and a culture that learns rather than blames. And we must refine definitions to avoid ambiguity, and we must ensure the practical operation strengthens relationships rather than weakens them. So, Presiding Officer, I support the motion to agree the general principles at stage 1, with parents and carers at the very forefront of my mind, and with a clear expectation of tightened definitions at stage 2, because families deserve consistency, children deserve dignity, and staff deserve a system that supports them to keep everyone safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Adam. And I call the final speaker in the open debate, George Adam. Around 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, for me, this has been a difficult bill to fully get my head around. Not because the problem it seeks to address is unclear, but because we must be honest about how this would work in the real world, in our classrooms, in the toughest of days for teachers and staff who are already under immense pressure. But equally, Presiding Officer, I'm also the grandparent of a wonderful young woman, if you can call a 11-year-old a young woman, with autism. and we must take in her toughest days and the pressure she feels, and undertake to understand what she's feeling at that time as well. And I think one of the most important parts for me was when we heard from the parents and carers who have campaigned tirelessly for this bill, and they're talking about real harm and real trauma and real failure in the system. And the evidence we heard at committee was heartbreaking. Families spoke about children sustaining broken bones, severe bruising, deep psychological scars. One mother told us of her daughter was restrained on her very first day of secondary school, and that 20 years later she still cannot tolerate closed doors. That should worry every single one of us. But to go back on to the additional support needs part that was brought by my colleague Karen Adam as well, was there needs to be an understanding of young people and children with additional support needs, because that came out in the evidence as well, with the fact that some teachers, whether under pressure or whether under not understanding themselves. And I understand how that can be difficult as a grandparent. My daughter Jessica seems like a superhero now with the fact she deals with Daisy with some of the issues, but also we may have another young 3-year-old who may be is currently getting looked at to see if she is on the spectrum as well. So we have a kind of rather nice wee neurodiverse family within our family, but we need to understand that, and it can be difficult for people when they see a young person that is like that, because I remember when I've seen some of my grandchildren's first kind of breakdowns with regards to autism, and it can be scary and frightening at times, so I can understand where it would be difficult for teachers in a professional position. But, Presiding Officer, ignoring the very serious concerns raised by the EIS is not an issue either, because during stage 1, the evidence the EIS was clear and consistent in their message, and Tom Britton told the committee something we can't brush aside. He said, and I quote, "Without context of more funding and more staff, it's difficult to get beyond that." And he's absolutely right on that, because we cannot legislate as if staffing levels, workload and resources are abstract issues. To make this bill work properly and safely will require more staff. And that raises very real questions. And we're talking about are we talking about additional teaching staff, specialist support staff or administrative staff to handle reporting on monitoring duties? These decisions will land squarely at local authority level, and there are issues that cannot be ducked. Our teachers are already working in a very challenging environment. They're managing increasing complex additional support needs and growing administrative burdens. And the EIS warned us that this bill, if poorly implemented, risks creating a report culture based on fear rather than learning. That's not scaremongering, Presiding Officer. That's a legitimate concern from a workforce that wants to get it right. And we should be clear, our teachers are not the problem. So for this bill to deliver its aims, there are several issues that need to be addressed at stage 2. Definitions, as already been said, the current definition of restraint is so broad it risks capturing ordinary benign interactions with children. Secondly, seclusion. This is the most difficult and sensitive issue in the bill. Many witnesses describe seclusion as deprivation of liberty and potential human rights. So we need to get that definition right. And reporting on the data, Presiding Officer, is important as well, because we don't want to be in a situation where the EIS are looking at people are looking at data, and rather than being used as a tool to make things better in the area, it's used as some kind of league table. So, Presiding Officer, we must protect our children's rights and support teachers without creating fear, bureaucracy or unintended consequences. There is a lot of work still to be done in this bill, and I'm quite happy to work with us to ensure that we can make this bill the best it possibly can be.
Thank you. We now move to closing speeches. I call first Paul O'Kane, around 4 minutes. Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'll begin by trying to pick up on what we've heard this afternoon. And I think in doing so, beginning with committee work, because I think that's very important. I think we've heard that referred to throughout contributions this afternoon, and indeed from members of the Education, Children and Young People's Committee. I was not a member of the committee when it took evidence, but I think was clear, and now having been inducted to their very lengthy meetings of a Wednesday morning, I know that they will have spent a lot of time forensically looking at the detail of the evidence that was presented, and I think that's reflected in the report. And I think we heard that actually from Willie Rennie, from the Cabinet Secretary, indeed referred to, and the convener. And I think that was about ensuring that there was strong scrutiny of the bill, and ensuring that Daniel Johnson was put under that scrutiny in order to explain how he felt the bill would progress, and also to ensure that the voices in this bill were heard, not least, of course, the campaigners, as we've heard already, but crucially the points that have been raised about teachers and the concerns that teachers and school professionals have. I know that Daniel Johnson will turn to those, as I said in my opening. He will turn to those perhaps in his closing, but we also have an opportunity, I think, as the bill progresses, to address some of those more fully as well. I think also in reflecting this afternoon on some of the process that sits around the bill, I think what Daniel Johnson said about the non-governmental bill unit is indeed correct. I think very often they are perhaps the unsung heroes of Parliament in terms of the process and ensuring that bills are well drafted, are well considered, and are able to be brought to this Parliament for scrutiny and for us to discuss these issues and to take a decision on the principles, as we will this afternoon, and then to move them forward into the subsequent stages. I was reflecting in my opening, Presiding Officer, that I had 7 years working for Enable Scotland, and in my time with Enable we produced a number of important pieces of work and a number of reports looking at the whole issue of course, seclusion and restraint in schools and the abuses very often that have happened, and we've heard reference to this afternoon. But I think more widely trying to look at the school experience of young people who have a learning disability, autism and neurodivergence. And I think trying to reflect on their experience and how do we make it better, and how do we crucially make the experience better for those children and young people, but also for their parents. And it led me, I remembered a statistic in my head that came from the included in the main report. And at that point, the hundreds of parents and carers of young people with a disability that we surveyed said that they found the school system and their experience of the school system stressful was a word that was used, a battle was a word that was used, that they felt alone in that system, that they felt cut off from decision-making. And I think that is probably what has been reflected most, I think, in this afternoon's debate, is that we are, of course, trying to set things right for children and young people who've experienced inappropriate use of seclusion and restraint. But crucially, we're also trying to support those parents and carers who are facing daily challenges and finding it very hard often to get to the truth of what is happening to their children and young people, and crucially being able to move beyond that and to build a strong relationship with those who, as Daniel Johnson said, are in loco parentis. So I hope that as a result of the bill that we will pass today and the work that we will do to progress this bill into its second and third stages and to put it on the statute book will mean that when we return to Parliament in the next session, we are able to look back and reflect on the work that will be carried out in our local authorities and hope that we reduce that burden that parents have felt, where we hope we have less parents who will describe their school experiences as stressful, a battle, or feeling alone or cut off. I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. And I call Rose McCall. Again, around 4 minutes, Ms McCall.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Again, I would like to add my congratulations to Daniel Johnson for the queen of work that goes in to bring a bill to this stage. And all the work that has gone into that. And I also would like to congratulate, as many have done in the Chamber today, to Beth Morrison and Kate Sanger. They've done a wheen of work as well. And I think it's important to mention that it is incumbent on all of us in this place to take this forward, to look at where we are now and progress, and also make sure that we make this bill the best it can be for them. This is not the end of the road. This is just halfway along. So I think this debate has made one thing abundantly clear. Whilst the vast majority of our teachers and school staff act professionally and with the utmost care and compassion every single day, the system around restraint and seclusion in Scotland isn't working as it should. And we must be clear that restraint and seclusion should never be a routine practice. I think that was mentioned in the submissions by both Miles Briggs and Karen Adam regarding de-escalation. And that has to be the first port of call. Restraint and seclusion should only be used as a last resort in circumstances where there is an immediate risk of harm to the child and to others, and there's always within the framework that prioritises dignity, rights and well-being of relevant staff, to support the child involved and for the child. And it's consistency that I think that matters here, not only for pupils and families, but for that staff. Teachers and support staff deserve clarity. And I think that was a very good point made by Willie Rennie. He was talking about it's the middle of the road circumstances that maybe don't fit. I personally think it's the other way round. I think it's the ones that's on the extreme that maybe the guidance doesn't quite match, and therefore that's where we have the problem. But the fact of the matter is clarity is required regardless of how you look at it, and that's what we're trying to do. So we need clarity, training, robust guidance, so that their teachers and children are supported proportionally and with confidence in the most challenging of situations. So I'm going to quote what Kate Sanger said to the committee. The reasons given for the use of restraint often include non-compliance, children making poor choices, sensory overload, bad language and screaming. And she went on to explain that children and young people don't have the language skills or the verbal skills, and that screaming is a way of communicating their needs. So imagine being restrained for trying to explain yourself. That's just not acceptable. There is clear evidence that the use of restraint and seclusion is inconsistent across Scotland's schools. Practices vary widely between local authorities and in between individual schools, and it's not acceptable that parents are not informed when these serious interventions are used. We all have heard in our casework of circumstances where this has happened. No parent should discover that their child has been restrained or secluded because their child comes home distressed, withdrawn, unable to explain what has happened to them, or covered in cuts and bruises or having broken bones. And it's that lack of transparency that causes real harm. It can compound trauma in children, particularly those with additional support needs, who may struggle to communicate their experiences or to process the distressing events. And for families, being kept in the dark undermines trust and makes it harder to advocate effectively for their child or to work constructively with the schools to put the right support in place. So we need clear safeguards, proper recording and meaningful parental involvement. And has already been mentioned by Daniel Johnson, Maggie Chapman, Willie Rennie, the bill affords us that opportunity to move this onto a statutory footing. And that's what we're trying to achieve. It recognises that relying on non-statutory guidance alone has not been enough. It acknowledges the living experiences of children, young people and families who have raised concerns over many years, and it signals a commitment to learn from those experiences and to do better. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, we are supporting the general principles of the bill. We'll do so in the spirit of constructive engagement, working with the Government and with stakeholders to ensure that the legislation is clear, proportionate and effective in practice, because every child in Scotland deserves to feel safe, respected and protected in their school, and every family deserves honesty, transparency and confidence in the system that's meant to support them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McCall. I now call Johnny Goldruth to wind up on behalf of the Government. Cabinet Secretary, around 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and my thanks also to members across the Chamber today for their contributions to this debate, which has been remarkable in relation to the conciliatory tone we have had across the Chamber, so close to dissolution on a topic on which we all agree. I'd also like to express my thanks to our partners in local government, our teaching trade unions and to all education staff and, of course, parents who, as we've been hearing today, have supported our work in this area today. Of course, the Government will continue to engage with all of these partners, but also more substantively with Daniel Johnson in relation to the bill and its progress at stage 2 and 3. What we have heard today, though, Presiding Officer, is that there is a will across Parliament to build on the actions that have already been taken by the Government. And our long-standing position, as we know, is that restraint and seclusion should only ever be used as a last resort, and we are committed to protecting Scotland's children and young people. I want to come to some of the comments made by colleagues across the Chamber this afternoon, if I may, although I am aware that time is short. Miles Briggs reminds the Chamber of Beth Morrison's son Callum, and Douglas Ross says that we would not be here were it not for Beth and Kate Sanger. And Paul O'Kane spoke to the dreadful things which have happened to families, which is a necessity of where we find ourselves today. And it has been, as Maggie Chapman rightly reminds the Chamber, a tireless campaign. Largely, I would observe, a campaign led by mums whose experience of our education system has not been what it should have been, mums who have had to fight. And there are many parallels with the legislation before Parliament today and parental experiences of, for example, additional support needs support locally. And I'm reflective in listening to contributions from colleagues today about my constituent Niamh Braid and her fight that her mother had to lead and her father with Fife Council in relation to obtaining the necessary support she required as a BSL user in school in Fife. That should not be the way that our education system delivers support to families. Willie Rennie spoke to the need for the guidance to be put on a statutory footing to help bring decisiveness and clarity. And I do note, I have to say, the concerns of my former trade union, the EIS, which has been mentioned in the debate today on this issue. I have committed and I've written to the EIS to further engagement with them ahead of stage 2 and stage 3, and I know the member in charge has additionally, and I look forward to working with him on that topic. It is worthwhile saying that the teaching trade unions were involved in the development of the government's guidance, and we would continue to engage with them in relation to the review and, of course, stage 2 and stage 3, working with the member in charge. Jackie Dunbar speaks to the interplay between the national guidance and the bill before Parliament. And I'm very pleased that the review, which is well underway, will report in March. She is also right to talk about commencement dates, a matter I've engaged with Daniel Johnson on already, and we are in agreement that learning from that review must inform how the Act is delivered in practice in our educational settings. Claire Bater was also right to talk about inconsistencies in terms of recording practices. I think this is a point that Ros McCall touched on additionally. This is an issue that we see across our educational landscape. And I view that this bill will have a key role to play in strengthening the quality and consistency of data, something we have already actively started to consider in relation to additional support needs, as colleagues will know from the update I provided earlier this year. Karen Adams spoke about the need for parents to be treated as partners, and to that end I very much agree with the committee's approach to reporting on the same day. Families, staff and children deserve dignity, and much of this has to be about better communication. George Adams spoke about the heartbreaking experience that the Education Committee have heard from families, which I know will be familiar to colleagues who sit on the committee. His observations on additional support needs are also salient to our recent debates in Chamber, and another reason why the review of initial teacher education provision, which I spoke to earlier this year, again, is so important. Teachers need support, but we need to recognise that needs in our classrooms are changing, and the way in which we support the profession requires to adapt accordingly. He's also correct to guard against the creation of league tables. We see this issue often in relation to behaviour in schools, with schools and teachers fearful to report, concerned about that it may reflect on their practice or on their school. But if we don't have accurate data, whether that's on behaviour, on ASN or on the use of restraint, how can any government really target the support to where it is needed most? I think we need far greater transparency in all of these matters, less protectionism, far more engagement and support for the teaching profession. Presiding Officer, in concluding, I would like to thank Daniel Johnson for bringing this bill before Parliament, and I pay particular tribute again today to Beth Morrison, Kate Sanger and to all the parents, children and young people whose lives have been impacted by these issues. No family should have to endure the experiences that members have heard and some have narrated today. But I believe we have an opportunity today to change lives and to create positive, inclusive and safe school environments. The Scottish Government is therefore happy to support the general principles of Daniel Johnson's bill.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I call on Daniel Johnson, the member in charge, around 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I almost don't quite know how to respond to such kind of overwhelming and universal compliments that I've received this afternoon. And look, I wouldn't claim that I'm not occasionally without my theatrical flourish in this place, but I do try to approach my work in a collegiate business, a collegiate way, to deal with things matter-of-factly and work with people right the way across this chamber. And I hope some of that is reflected. I too would just like to reiterate my thanks to Beth, Callum and of course Kate Sanger. I think Kate and Beth are something of a dynamic duo, a dream team. And I would also just like to reflect on something that Douglas Russ touched on. I believe in this place because it brings power closer to people and it makes the possibility of change much more realistic for people. And I think this process, if we pass this bill, will demonstrate to Beth and Kate that it is delivering on that promise to Scottish people. I think we should also be clear about what we're talking about. You know, restraint and seclusion, in terms of the most serious instances, is about children, very often vulnerable children, being pinned down, held in stress and prone positions. We're talking about seclusion, putting in a locked room, sometimes called a chill-out room, but it's not. It's a cupboard with a lock, or sometimes a padded room. That's not right, not in this day and age. And if it happens, if that has to happen, we need the most robust procedures around it. Whenever the state intervenes physically, using force, we expect and we demand, rightly, for that have robust monitoring and supervision. And I ask the question, Why would we not have that expectation for our children? So we must, I think, acknowledge the EIS concerns. And I thought Maggie Chapman did an excellent job of dealing with those. But let me reiterate their key concerns around timing, the legal questions for individual teachers, training, workload and league tables. On timing, it is not true to say that the provisions of this bill are new and only introduced in the 2024 guidance. The 2017 guidance makes it very clear that local authorities should have clear procedures and training available for teachers. It goes on to say that all instances of the decision to use physical intervention must be recorded and monitored. And that was in 2017. So that is not new. And I would finally reflect, we very often legislate without the guidance, the detailed guidance which implements measures that we pass in this place in legislation after the passage of that bill. We actually have the advantage here in that we have a decade or more of guidance that we can build on so we actually know what we're talking about. On the legal question, let's be very clear. The obligations here will be for local authorities and for schools, not on individual teachers. That's not to say individual teachers will not be asked to play their part, but critically, the obligations rest at that level. Likewise, on training, it simply restates what is already in guidance about the training being made available. There is no point in this legislation where it says all teachers must be trained. On workload, and let us be very clear on this point, there should be no additional workload. If the EIS, as they agree that this should be recorded, there should be no addition. But critically, we know that accidental injuries are being recorded in a very comprehensive way. This is something that is part of current practice, and if it is being omitted when it is deliberate interventions, I think there are actually bigger questions to ask. And finally, on league tables, let's be clear about what the legislation sets out, is that this information will be gathered at local authority level and then passed on to ministers. So there are two actually important safeguards there. First of all, it will not be provided to ministers at a school-by-school basis. It will be provided by a local authority. And then very deliberately, I left it at the discretion of ministers about how that will be detailed, because we do need to take care, and jigsaw identification must be avoided. But let's also, I think, note that the GTCS not just were supportive and broadly of this bill, they actually made the point that we perhaps need to go further, reflecting, I think, on many of the points raised by the Cabinet Secretary. And indeed, ADES have taken a very constructive approach. I'm almost out of time, and I've had between 6 minutes of my introduction and 5 minutes. I have to pack a lot in as the member in charge. But let me just say on definitions. Let's be very clear. We do need to ensure that, particularly around practice, particularly around recording and reporting, that we're not inadvertently capturing other things. I think, as some members pointed out, hugs are not restraint. A supportive hand on the shoulder is not restraint. And while the definition here does talk about removing the ability to voluntarily move, I think we can tighten that up. And what I will look at, and let me be very candid here about the sorts of things, is about that deliberate use, about the sorts of things about the length of time, the risks involved, and the nature of that intervention need to be captured, particularly around the recording and reporting, so that we don't create unnecessary work. But I think that is doable. I'm very keen to work with the trade unions, with other relevant bodies, with the government and with everyone in this chamber to make sure that we get those definitions right. And indeed, on the other points, which I agree, I think all the points raised by the committee are right, and I will hope to work on amendments either directly myself or with others to ensure that we improve this bill. And can I thank everyone for their contributions this afternoon. Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. That concludes the debate on restraint and seclusion in schools. Scotland Bill at Stage 1. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business to allow front benches to change.